today the question is one of precision. Also, it's a question related to the tree and how we use the tree as a bioclimatic tool. So bioclimatism is a bit of a neologism that is related to habitat. In fact, I am passionate about eco-construction. I self-built my house, and therefore I have extensively researched how to build a house that is both economical, comfortable, constructed with a maximum of materials derived from agriculture and thus from the landscape, and then how to integrate myself into the landscape. How to, there you go, building a cozy nest. And ultimately, this notion of bioclimatism, I think about it and reflect on it, not only for humans, of course, but also, it's also for now, for cultivated plants. In fact, since every living being inhabits where it is, and so living where we are also means connecting with this landscape. So connecting, but taking advantage of the energies received, the available energies, certainly the light, the air, the water, and managing to benefit from these aspects, but also protecting oneself from these excesses, thanks to the elements of the landscape. In the bioclimatism, question of habitat, protecting oneself from excesses means shielding from the cold, the heat and the solar light that can be too intense, protecting oneself from the wind as well, but it's exactly the same thing for the environment. It's exactly the same for agriculture. So these two concepts have always been with me, and this perspective we can have on the tree today, the tree in our systems, actually perfectly corroborates the search for comfort we can have. Since having built this house, I realized today, when going to other types of construction, that the comfort this house generates helps me to be in good shape and to be connected. And actually, I think it might be the same for plants. So maybe we can try to use these concepts and this architectural knowledge and protection for our system. So once we've built a house that captures the sun and protects us from the cold, we need to learn to conserve and store energy, and also to redistribute it. And so this is very interesting, because these are concepts related to the thermal properties of materials. We talk about the effusivity of materials. So effusivity is their ability to connect, to resonate with temperature, with air, with water. So it's the way they increase in temperature, for example, in terms of effusivity. And then there is diffusivity, which is the ability to distribute. Diffusivity is once the material has absorbed energy, how it will redistribute that energy. When we talk about materials in the environment, we can talk about material. We can talk about materials. We can talk about soils, for example. The effusivity and diffusivity of soils are crucial in our way of designing and understanding the fertility, for example, of soils. We have seen this clearly, for example, with wine growers during frost episodes. Every time there is a frost, the situation is different. Sometimes it's better with covered soil, sometimes it's better with bare soil, sometimes it's better on certain soils, sometimes it's better on other soils. And we don't understand, and we muddle things up, as they say in the Southwest, in every possible way. And we never manage to build a coherent vision. In fact, this coherent vision must be developed at the landscape level. That's what Bruno tells us. So naturally, we have airflows, water flows, but also materials. And so these materials resonate with these airflows and water flows, and that's how we should think, I believe, to improve the resilience of our systems and the efficiency of our systems. In fact, taking advantage of climatic conditions means first taking advantage of light. And for that, there are tools that are used. It's a solar shading tool. It's the path of the sun according to the seasons, according to the hours. And so, with this diagram, you can at any time, if you use this diagram, know the height of the sun and how the sun impacts the surface you want to study. So that's very interesting. Then it allows us to understand that, yes, of course, in winter, the sun is lower and rises more in the south, well, just southeast, and it sets southwest. Whereas in the middle of summer, or even at the summer solstice, in fact, it will rise completely northeast and set southwest. And in fact, this is the basis for understanding how the system works. That is to say, we must take advantage of this system. Often we have the impression that the plots to the south are the warmest, but that's a mistake, because the plots to the south are warm in winter, but are rather relatively temperate. In summer, relatively temperate, especially if they are on a slope. Imagine a plot to the south. On a slope, naturally, it will receive much less sunlight. In the morning, because the sun will rise very far away, and then much less sun in the evening as well, because it will set very far away. And then at noon, when the sun will be very, very high, it will be quite easy to shade this plot. In fact, this perspective on the sun's path is absolutely essential in all layouts, and it's the same for houses. For example, a house with bay windows facing due south, really exclusively due south, is not a house that overheats. On the other hand, a house with a bay window facing west is a disaster. And in fact, we use these concepts by asking ourselves questions about how this light circulates and how we can benefit from it or protect ourselves from it. In this bioclimatism, naturally, we are also interested in airflows. And I imagine in the Mediterranean, this is a major concern. Whether it's the Mistral or the Tramontane, these airflows have a considerable impact on the climatism of the plots. And so this is where we can look at the works a bit from Dominique Saltner or other works done by permaculturists like Hogram or people like that on airflows. So these airflows, we are now well aware of these issues with the impact of hedges, the impact of trees on channeling these airflows. So we also know that, yes, a hedge protects along its length, but what we also know is that if we design the landscape using trees as a guide and as a stimulation for the circulation of energies, we can also limit, for example, frost phenomena. We can also increase them. If we start having trees that end up at the bottom of a plot, we will store the masses of cold air that naturally tend to descend. And so we will either cool the plot if needed or store the cold and prevent it from escaping if we have frost. So, in fact, we should be able to manage and generate, to use the tree as a tool, as a structuring tool. The microclimate on the plot, that's indeed the challenge. I could have shown this slide just a bit earlier because that's what it's talking about. A tree right in the middle of a plot that forms a hedge will, as we see in the image on the right, slow down the airflow. And we will have a cold airflow just before the tree. It might simply be enough to cut a few lower branches to allow this cold airflow to escape. Trees are tools. In fact, they can cause problems, and we see it because in raw agriculture, just saying that we need to reintroduce trees puts all the farmers on edge because it's something that is not understood. We don't understand because we don't have a grasp of the fundamental knowledge needed to understand the microclimate and how we can benefit from this tool, a bioclimatic protection tool. That is to say, to build a favorable habitat for our environment, for our overall landscape, as Bruno said, and that's what was fantastic. Here, from what I heard or understood, is that we don't just think about the plot, since it's the entirety of the landscape that produces. And so, by reintroducing the tree as a tool for the entirety of the landscape, modestly, humans can also find themselves being somewhat creators of the landscape and productivity in the broader sense of the landscape. So, it's also productivity for the fauna and flora, the fungi, as he says, and thus the entirety of what makes it so that today we have resilience and an ability to maintain systems in health. There are as many forms of trees as there are trees, and that is really very interesting in the way trees are structured. We can simply use trees for what they are. We can use and transform them as we did with pollarded trees, but also we can choose the right tree in the right place. The right tree in the right place is not necessarily a tree that needs to be maintained. And that is the same for all landscape systems. We see in cities with all these trees that are constantly maintained, there is over-maintenance, there is over-action compared to the needs we have. We can also simply choose the species based on its shape, size, growth habit, way of connecting bon bulb, and way of providing protection. Audioquant foliage density. More or less thick, a tree with very strong verticality, with a very columnar vertical axis, or a more colony-like tree with low apical dominance, which results in many buds competing with each other and having a multitude of branches. A tree with a much more open shape, which will cast a much wider shadow. Generally, it's a tree that will be a bit shorter. In fact, we have all the tools available with a considerable plant palette in the system. So yes, there you have it. The shape of trees is a fantastic bioclimatic tool. But let's plant the right tree in the right place. The right tree in the right place, because in plots, for example, in a plot where we need light, there are agricultural systems where we need a bit of shade. In market gardening, there are certain crops, like lettuce, for example, where we need a bit of shade. Too much light is not very good. So the tree is a great tool to support these crops. But there are other crops, like vines, for example, where integrating trees into viticultural systems is a good idea because the vine is not naturally avine. But for productivity, we need to be careful because the vine needs a lot of light to be able to produce. So if there are too many trees, it will produce less, but it will be healthy. There's no problem with that. There is no direct competition between the tree and the vine. The competition is related to a poor understanding of the flow management phenomena between the tree, the vine, and soil fertility. It's simply that which creates the competition here. What interests us is to understand that we must be able to, depending on the shapes, the silhouettes, the sizes, and the tools we use for the tree, build a system that allows us to shade as we wish. The system, that is to say, to manage the wash, the tree as a production tool. So you see here, simply in the way the tree generates shade, we must ask questions necessarily about the tree in relation to the exposure and in relation to the slope. A tree on a flat surface will not have the same shade cast as on a sloped surface. Therefore, we must be concerned with all these questions. And then today we are looking to develop systems to understand the impact of shade. That is to say, we will try to understand what is with the shape of the tree, what is the time that the plot can benefit from in relation to the tree density. So this is a small animation made on SketchUp. It's not really an animation. I've put photos one after the other. And it was done by a winemaker named Didier Berthollier, who is in Chignin in Savoy. I don't know if you are familiar with the vineyards of Chignin, but they are extremely steep and face south. It's south-facing, backed by the mountain, but it's a real scorcher with slopes at 45%. It's incredibly steep. They say that our vines suffer tremendously starting in August. It's really terrible. It is said that we might need to start asking ourselves questions about how to reforest Chignin to protect the vines and continue producing. One wouldn't imagine that in Savoy it could get too hot, but I can assure you that with a 45-degree slope, south-facing. In Chignin, there are certain times when it gets super hot, and it's not necessarily in the middle of summer. Here, it's in the middle of August, on August 4th, and these are trees which for a trial, were constructed as if they were 8 meters high and 4 meters wide at the base. So this is at 9 a.m., 11 a.m., you see. In fact, the idea is to rather look at how the shadows move. Noon, so not solar noon, here it's solar noon. So 2 p.m. in the afternoon. And actually, we see that the shadows move and that we always have a movement of these shadows with a shading that is never total. And so here, the question we ask ourselves is how to model and ensure understanding of what the solar mask is. So what is the proportion of shadow there will be? So we have divided all this into small squares, and we try to see, depending on the time of day, the percentage of sunlight that can be on the surface. So we ask ourselves these extremely detailed questions because we know with a vine that it can swing one way or the other, meaning it needs a certain amount of light to be able to develop flower embryos in its buds for the next year. So in fact, if you have shade this year, you won't have fruit next year. This is what the vine has developed to be able to climb trees. If it has to climb trees, it shouldn't waste energy producing grapes. All its energy needs to be channeled to be able to climb the tree. So in fact, it doesn't bear fruit when it's in the shade. It's its system to connect, to be in symbiosis with the tree system. As a result, we use this concept by thinking that once the vine can climb, it will climb above the tree and will bear fruit. Now, what we are going to do is build a system where the vine won't need to climb above the tree, but it can still benefit from the tree's shade. Because here we have an excess of light, and this is typically what happens in the south of France and throughout the Mediterranean basin. What used to determine the quality of wines yesterday has become a significant constraint because we have sun exposure that is far too intense, leading to ripening issues, even problems with grape quality, and the vine's resilience with occurrences of apoplexy and death. Very common. We even have old vines that can't hold up. So we are questioning how we could bioclimatize the plots. Well, there you go. Bioclimatizing the plots, one of the tools, it could be the tree. We can consider using this tool to operate. It's not something new, putting trees in the vineyards. When Napoleon asked a certain Jules Guyot to tour France's viticulture to see and to serve, in fact, he toured France to see all the initiatives and to serve the education and teaching of viticulture. He completed this tour of France and produced 12 volumes of a book in which agroforestry plays a significant role. We were surprised when we found it. It's from 1810, 1820. We find ourselves with a lot of viticultural systems that use trees. The tree was completely integrated into all the viticultural systems. And that means it's not new. And it means that indeed we're not inventing much. And we should be able to reintroduce trees very easily. And we will have so much more light than there was in the time of Jules Dubiot that we should be able to do this effortlessly. It's high time to plant trees in the vineyard. Well, there you go. We choose the trees. We follow people who plant trees. We encourage them to plant trees in the vineyard, but we realize that it's not so simple because it requires detailed knowledge. Knowledge about the choice of species, their growth, the choice of rootstocks. So we put in trees, I put in fruit trees, but then I say, and which rootstock? I don't know, it's the nurseryman who gave me that. But actually, it's super important because you need to manage the shape of your tree based on the shade you want to create. Is your plot oriented north, south, east, west? Do you have a slope? Do you want to create a lot of shade or just a little? Do you have soil that will be covered? In fact, these are all questions you need to ask yourself. You need to ask questions about the origin of the soil, meaning its ability to recover, store energy, and redistribute it. All of this is extremely important for designing agricultural systems around these trees. Can it, of course, always intervene and shape the tree, but once again, and I also take this from what Bruno was telling us earlier, once again, it's not an economy of means. If we have to add trees and prune all the trees and intervene constantly and all the time, controlling the system, in fact, we expend a phenomenal amount of energy. And this phenomenal energy requires phenomenal skill, because if you have to manage the system, manage the trees, prune the trees, there's nothing more complicated. Pruning the vine is starting to get complicated. I'm explaining this to you in all my training sessions, but pruning trees, believe me, is another matter entirely. It's another matter entirely. And so this skill must allow us to, taking these skill needs should allow us to address these skill needs, take a step back to find the right tree in the right place. And we must understand how we can integrate the system into the landscape by trying not to add interventionism and forcing ourselves to intervene for the system to work. So, in my opinion, we must also think about the landscape. And the landscape represented here is actually a place in Austria where there are a lot of vineyards, and you can see that it has been sculpted. Like, our terraces are, one could imagine, banyuls with a bit more herbs. Ultimately, we end up with landscapes with very significant diversity, with a lot of uncultivated areas simply because of the slopes. We see the embankments that are grassed or wooded, and we see a landscape that is rich in diversity and that will allow our plants to inhabit a place that is pleasant, because for us it would be pleasant to live in a place like that, wouldn't it? For me, it would be really very pleasant. I find that this landscape is magnificent. And I think if it's pleasant for me, and if it's fluid and constructed like this, with terraces that protect, orientations that take advantage of energies, flows that are directed, that are channeled, it's also pleasant for the plant. So there you have it. The tree is a superb tool for land management, bioclimatism, and the air conditioning of our agricultural systems.